Welcome back to another episode of the Collaborative IEP podcast. I'm Ashley Barlow, your host, and I am so happy you're here. Hey, you know how last week it took me like 18 times to say that? This only took me three, and I am getting in a groove. So this rebrand is starting to land, friends. I am I am truly so happy you're here, and I'm really excited about this episode. So in this episode, we're talking about IQ testing, and we're specifically talking basically about whether or not to IQ test, but that's a little more complicated. So this is an issue that comes up a lot in my law practice and when I'm talking to my friends, when I'm talking to other advocates. I mean, like I probably talk about this twice a week. And it's really kind of like founded in this inclusion idea. The idea is, how does IQ testing impact disability category? Because I am afraid that my school, this is what people say, I am afraid, or my client is afraid that my school is going to use my disability category to put me in a certain classroom. And it doesn't necessarily matter when I get this question if people are looking for a classroom that's more or less restrictive, people are still afraid it's gonna happen. And so in this episode, what we're gonna talk about is IQ testing, what it is, what kind of the common pitfalls are about it. We're gonna talk about disability categories, and then we're gonna kinda relate that to LRE or inclusion settings. They tie together really nicely, and I'm hoping I can do it for you really efficiently. This is something I've talked about in prior episodes whenever I have a school psych on, Erin Mahaffey, April Rerig, I talk about it, and we did just talk about it when I interviewed Pepper Stetler, who is, a friend who wrote a book about the IQ test. So, we talk about it, but it happens often enough that I thought I would record an episode about it so that I could honestly refer clients there. It just makes things a little bit easier and therefore a little bit cheaper for my clients when they kinda get my little, like, 20-minute ditty on this topic. So you're benefiting too, friends, and that's really fun. All right. IQ testing, disability category, and inclusion, what parents need to know. That's what we're talking about. So, first of all, IQ testing. Um, IQ testing is looking at okay, so like the idea of an IQ test, and I did not research this, but like this is out of my brain. Okay. So, an IQ test, I mean, I've done plenty of research on this topic. I'm just saying, like, I'm not gonna like hit the nail on the head on what an IQ test does. But generally speaking, the IQ test, your IQ is supposed to talk about your aptitude um, from, like, a whole life standpoint, especially academically. So, like, what is your general intelligence, really? And IQ test, as you've probably seen if you've had your child IQ tested. If not, like, look up subparts to an IQ test. It'll tell you things depending on which one you're looking at because there are lots of different IQ tests. But it'll tell you things about your child's visual processing, auditory processing, their working memory, their processing speed, um, those things. And then when it looks at all of those together, it generates your aptitude, your general ability index, or your full scale IQ score. It can do that taking into your verbal capabilities, and it can also generate a nonverbal score, which is particularly helpful for children that have any kind of language deficits, like expressive language or receptive language difficulties. Uh, Um, but of course, it's not foolproof, right? So when we look at these tests, and by the way, we're talking about like the Stanford Binet and the WISC and those, kind of common ones that schools do a lot. Um, we have to remember that IQ tests are certainly not a full picture of a child's ability or a child's aptitude. And there's lots of different biases that come into IQ testing. There's a fair amount of research that indicates that there's cultural bias. Just think about experiences that people that don't speak English or people that have grown up in different cultures experience when they take a test that's, made in America and for lifelong America dwellers. Um, there's linguistic um, bias. So, words and vocabulary and phrases that we use in some spots in America are different than what we use in other spots. When I first started teaching in Louisville, I was going to rent a floor of my house to another young teacher, and she said that she had looked at pricing at other apartments, and she was like, "I was about to fall out," and I had no idea that that meant pass out or like lose consciousness. And I was like, "Huh, I've never heard that, fall out," and I haven't heard it very many times since, but my mom, who went to, college in the South, just an hour and a half south of us, but in the South, was like, "Oh, that means to pass out." Um, so imagine if you missed a test, question because you didn't know language like that. And then there's, biases relative to disability. I had I just said this in a recent podcast episode, but since we're talking about it here, the best way I can describe this is I had a psychologist at Cincinnati Children's explain to me that when testing a child on, I think she was describing the WISP, but then somebody else told me later it was a different intelligence test. But some IQ test is like, okay, so maybe we're trying to test the child's visual spatial aptitude ability. Um, Intelligence, right? And like, by the way, the interview with Pepper Stetler's like, "Define intelligence." Like, that's a big question, right? So, like, we could get really rhetorical, but let me give you a really specific example. So maybe they're attempting to test your visual spatial processing or intelligence, if that's the word you wanna use. So they'll say, "Okay, Jack, pick up the, um, and let's say there's a barn, and one of them there's a barn. I know that for a fact. So pick up the brown horse and move it to the left of the front door, but over the barrel of hay, whatever it is. It's like a four-step instruction, and it has all of these other components to it besides, um, like, do you know basically your prepositions of beside, over, to the left of. So of course, if you can do that, then your visual processing is on par. But it doesn't take into account the fact that, um, you know, that's a four-step instruction or that, um Jack is c like, in Jack's case, sorry, that was an alarm, and I'm in the middle of this, so I'm just gonna keep rolling with it. But I am going to do what the alarm told me to do as well. Mm, so so in Jack's case, he's colorblind, and so he can't figure out which horse, like, maybe if the 2, horses were, like, similar enough colors, he couldn't tell the difference between the horses, that sorta thing. And then never mind the fact that Jack needs a lot of he needs instructions broken down in order to hear them from a receptive language standpoint. So maybe if you had said, "You see the brown horse?" Okay, cool, pick that up. Now, how many doors are on the thing? There's 2 doors. Awesome. Now, look at the door, like look at the front doors. There. That's the front door, right. Now, which side is to the left of that? Cool. You see a hay bale? We're looking to put it behind the hay bale. Awesome, you did it. Well, because these tests are standardized, we cannot we cannot break those instructions down. We cannot say, "Oh, honey, that's the blue one." If you're colorblind, that messes up with the standardization of the test. And so there is bias in these things for, all kinds of different disability related things. All right. So imagine how that could continue on. That's just one specific example that I think is quite helpful. So then how is IQ testing related to disability category? Well, what I want for you to do is tonight when you're bored, and if you are like me, when everybody else takes a couch cushion and there's no couch cushion for you because you took a big office and you moved your TV room to the little room and you have to have a littler couch and it's uncomfortable to sit, all of you squished on one couch, or when you're just a mom that's tired of people and you go to your bed, instead of scrolling tonight, I want for you to type into your search bar, um, your state's name. So Kentucky in my case, Department of Education, um, and then disability well, why don't you do Kentucky Department of Education, special education eligibility form, okay? Special education eligibility form, and then start opening them up. You're gonna see that there are different disability categories. So, remember that form, and I'm gonna give you a little context. Alright, okay, so there are under the federal law IDEA, there are 13 different disability categories. In order to qualify for an IEP, you have to have a disability. And so, the federal government had to be like, well, now we have to define disability. So they're like, actually, we can define 13 different kinds of disability. And so people can qualify for those disabilities, but we have to have criteria to follow them because it's got to be consistent. And so they came up with these different disability categories. There's orthopedic impairment, there's hearing impairment, there's a speech and language impairment. And then there are some that have to do with intelligence. And your state might even break the ones that have to do with intelligence down into smaller components, which is kind of where this starts to get a little hairy. Um, so, a lot of the ones that have to do with intelligence, state by state, will look at two different scores. They will look at your IQ score and your adaptive behavior score. And they will look at your how many standard deviations away from the mean or the average you are. We're talking stats. A lot of these tests are graded or scored on the bell curve. In fact, most of them are done on the bell curve. And so we're talking about how many standard deviations you are away from the mean. Um, and so that will put you in a disability category, especially if you're talking about um, the the disability categories that have to do with intelligence, okay? Like cognitive impairment or, in Kentucky, where I practice law, there is mild mental disability and there is, functional mental disability, 2 different disability categories for a child with, what I would call a cognitive impairment, okay? So in order to be placed in a disability category, you have to have a cognitive score and an adaptive behavior score, in theory. But a lot of people say, well, hang on a second. If I go into like if they put me in FMD, for example, in Kentucky, which means that you are more significantly impacted by that cognitive impairment and by the adaptive behavior impairment, um, then am I going to be put in a self-contained classroom? So, to summarize this little piece, in order to qualify for a child with a disability, in order to qualify for an IEP, you have to be a child with a disability, which means you have to meet certain criteria for the different eligibility categories. And sometimes that gets a little sticky when the ones are considered for intelligence. Some people are like, I don't want an IEP for intelligence. Can't I get an IEP for other health impairment like ADHD or like, um, I don't know, some other medical condition? Or can I get an IEP for a specific learning disability, like a disability relative to my reading or my math processing? And the answer to all of that is yes. So, sidetrack. I realized we were in the summary, but sidetrack. I actually have this outlined out, and I'm probably not doing a very good job at following my outline. Welcome to this podcast. This is what we do. So, here's the sidetrack. Um, in order to get an IEP, you have to qualify as a student with a disability, which means you have to fall under one of those disability categories. Once you have the IEP, for the most part, with a few exceptions, because there's always exceptions, you know how lawyers are always like, well, it depends. But for the most part, for the majority of those disability categories, then you get services. So, you can qualify as a student with an other health impairment for ADHD and get reading goals. You can qualify as a student with multiple disabilities and get speech goals, as well as reading goals, as well as adaptive PE, okay? But so but it is my opinion, and this is just kind of like my opinion, this is my opinion, that your disability category should match up with your profile as much as to be expected, like, as best as possible, because the IEP should be kosher. Like, you shouldn't be hiding things, in the IEP process, okay? So that's disability category, okay? The connection between IQ testing and disability category is that in order to qualify for some of those disability categories, you have to have IQ testing. But remember how I said, in theory. A big thing is that a big problem is that IEP teams will overly rely. I don't know if that phrase was grammatically correct. There is an over reliance on IQ testing in determining eligibility category. And I think that's the big problem, right? Is that schools are like, well, we need an IEP score, or an IQ score. IQ scores give us so much information. Um, what I encourage IEP teams to say is, look, and this is particularly for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So, IQ testing is not a good indication of a child's aptitude if the child has an intellectual or developmental disability, period. There is no research that I know of that currently shows that. However, it's common sense that that's true. And, if that has happened to your child, if you have an IQ score that is just preposterous, even better. So I've had kids with Down syndrome that are, kids in my practice with Down syndrome that are participating in fully included sports, fully included academics. They are in the school play. They are talking, walking, dancing, telling hilarious jokes, etcetera, and their IQ will spit out as a 42, which is like 800 standard deviations from, the mean, like, about as low as it can possibly be. And I have literally, in cases where, schools are trying to let an IQ score drive the placement of a child, or their IQ score drives their eligibility category, which drives their placement, right? Which they can't do. I've literally, like, just Googled, what would I expect to be the functioning, day-to-day functioning of a person with a 42 IQ score? And then I kind of compare it to the child that's at the table, right? Because that is not a good indicator of ability. Uh, So I will sometimes have teams agree that the IQ score, we cannot put too much weight into the IQ score. We cannot overly rely on the IQ score in determining disability category. Instead, we should look at the full evaluation, including those adaptive behavior results, including the child's strengths, including teacher judgment, and including, like, academic performance, social performance, the other areas of development. And I have them do that before they even do the testing, because I want to make sure that we have that understanding before we do the testing. Okay. So then what's the fear? The fear is that disability category will drive placement. And actually, in the IEP Guru Academy videos, which launched last week, as you know, and I'm so excited, we have a video called Let's Get One Thing Straight. Disability category doesn't drive placement, because there's literally a regulation that says that you can't put a child in a educational placement solely because of their disability category. And we have all kinds of United States Department of Education guidance and dear colleague letters and that kind of stuff that says the same thing, and says it more plain terms. However, it continues to happen. So the concern is that your child's going to get a disability category that, and then the district's gonna say, "Oh, well, they have a 42 IQ and their disability category is cognitive impairment," or in Kentucky, functional mental disability. And then they would have to go into a certain classroom. They'd have to be in a self-contained special education classroom. So Um, and remember, I've seen this happen the other way. So I've seen kids that have super high IQs and they are fighting for more services or for more restrictive settings because of other factors, because of, their behaviors. I oftentimes see this with alternate placement where an IQ score, like the private schools that take kids, particularly autistic kids, will have kinda like their ideal profile, and they'll be like, "Well, we don't take a child with an IQ under or an IQ over," because they want, and I get it, like, they, generally speaking, want kids with similar profiles that are practicing the same skills, and strategies as the rest of the kids, because that really, really works. But it's hard when the IQ score gets in the way, especially if it's too high, because 'cause you're like, "Well," it's kinda like trying to get a job and they say, "Well, you're overqualified." And you're like, "Yeah, but I still want the job and I'm gonna stay." But they think you're gonna get bored and leave. Um, okay. So, but the guidance says and the regulations say that the disability category cannot drive placement. Now, there is one little way that they can, and that is if your state has a regulation that says that teachers with certain certificates, because when you teach, you get a certificate, it's not just like special ed. Then they have to teach kids in certain disability categories, and that's really interesting. If that's the case in your state, though, you still can use a teacher as a teacher without using the classroom as a place. So you can say, "Fine, I'll take that teacher, but I don't want that classroom to be my home base." And you can see if that works. You can also say, well, can that teacher come to me? Because if I have to have that teacher, great. Another thing that's worked before is, can I waive that teacher and sign something that says I'm okay with a different teacher who's available with my child's schedule or unique needs? So that's an interesting thing. But the fact of the matter is that regardless of it, the disability category cannot drive their placement. Now, in that video, the IEP Guru Academy video, we go through a lot of skills and strategies or a lot of advocacy strategies, in order to kind of combat this idea. So, like, what can you do if, the district tries to put you in a certain classroom because of your IQ score or because of your disability category. But for the purpose of today's podcast, I think that wraps it up. I just really wanted to be able to tie those three things together. Let's see if I can summarize it fairly well. So, IQ testing is sometimes needed, but in my opinion, overly valued to determine eligibility. You need eligibility in order to qualify for an IEP. Um, and once you have that eligibility category, though, it cannot be used solely to drive the educational placement or the setting in which the child is going to be educated. I hope I explained it well enough for you. Of course, this is complicated. This is work that I do day in and day out. So much of what I do is inclusion, and this happens a lot, right? So I am more than happy to chat with you anytime about this if you need a consultation as well. Just talk to me. I can consult in almost every state. I'm comfortable consulting in almost every state. Um, that IEP Guru Academy video called Let's Get One Thing Straight, Disability Category Doesn't Drive Placement is part of our inclusion series. Um, and in that video, we walk through basically some core concepts for inclusion, and then the 13 disability categories. So you get to see those. We talk about eligibility and how you make placement decisions, since that's kind of both ends of it. Like, first you become eligible, and at the end of the AEP, you get placed. And we talk about all of that federal guidance. We also talk about the continuum of placements from general education all the way down to home instruction and instruction in hospitals and institutions. Um, then we get to the federal guidance. And then I give you lots and lots of strategies in order to try to um, advocate for more or less restrictive environments, but this is part of the inclusion setting. So, or inclusion series. So, less restrictive educational placement if your district kind of gives you grief about that. So, and this video also includes 2 pages. It looks like probably close to 20 questions to ask. The inclusion series, I think almost every video ends with this really nice set of questions. And the questions I thought very deliberately about, and I structured them in very collaborative ways so that they continue discussions, as opposed to kind of like shutting things down. Like, this is how we do it here. So I hope that is helpful to you. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. It's something I talk to advocates about all the time. So maybe I'll refer them here too, and then I can just chat with them when they call. All right. We will see you next week. Same time, same place. Have a great week.